I was 31 years old the first time I understood what it meant to be truly afraid of someone who was supposed to love your family. Not scared like a horror movie, scared like watching someone smile at your mother while you know something is wrong and you have no proof and no one will believe you. And every day that passes is a day you can't get back. That was the year my stepfather, Raymond, moved into our house, and that was the year I started paying attention in ways I never had before. My mom, Judith, had been alone for 6 years when she met him. My biological father passed when I was 24. A heart attack. Sudden. One of those deaths that leaves everyone standing in a parking lot afterwards, wondering how the world kept moving. Mom took it hard. Harder than she ever let on, because that was her way. She kept working her nursing shifts, kept the house up, kept calling me every Sunday. But I could hear it in her voice. That particular kind of quiet that lives in people who've decided they'd rather be numb than sad anymore. So when she called me 2 years ago and said she'd met someone at her friend Cheryl's dinner party, I tried to be happy for her. I really did. His name was Raymond Colt, 58 years old, semi-retired, said he'd done well for himself in commercial real estate out in Phoenix before moving back to Virginia to be closer to his sister. He was charming in that easy, practiced way. The kind of man who remembers your coffee order on the second meeting and makes you feel like you're the most interesting person in the room. Mom was glowing when she talked about him. I hadn't heard that in her voice in years. I told myself to let her have it. I should have listened to the part of me that didn't. The first thing that felt off was the timeline. They met in September. By Thanksgiving, he was at her table. By Christmas, he'd given her a ring. By February, he'd moved in. When I mentioned it to my mom, gently, carefully, the way you do when you love someone and you're trying not to bruise anything, she laughed and said, "Sweetheart, I'm 63. I don't have time to take things slow." Raymond was right there when she said it. He looked at me over her shoulder and smiled. I smiled back. I moved back to Richmond from DC 8 months after their wedding. My lease was up. My roommate had gotten engaged and was moving in with her fiancé, and it made sense financially. I was a freelance medical coder, I could work from anywhere, and the cost of living in Richmond was half of what I was paying in the district. That's what I told people. That's mostly true. The other part is that by then I had started to notice things, small things. The way Raymond answered questions that were directed at my mother, the way certain bills had been switched to his name to simplify things. The way he'd casually mentioned one Sunday afternoon that Mom had added him to her checking and savings accounts, just in case anything happens. You know how it is. And Mom had nodded along like this was sensible and routine. I found a 2-bedroom rental 12 minutes from their house and signed a 1-year lease. I want to be honest about something here. I didn't move back because I had a plan. I didn't move back because I'd identified Raymond as dangerous. I moved back because my mother's voice had started to sound different again. Not that old grief quiet, but a new kind. Flatter, more careful, like someone choosing each word before setting it down. And I couldn't figure out why. The first year of me being back in Richmond was largely unremarkable in the ways that matter. Raymond was polite to me, friendly even. He'd throw burgers on the grill when I came over, ask about my work, make self-deprecating jokes about his golf game. If you'd watched us from the outside, you'd have thought we were a normal family, pleasantly navigating a blended situation. But I started keeping a note in my phone. Just observations, nothing dramatic, dates, times, things I overheard or noticed. March 14th, Mom mentioned wanting to visit Aunt Celia in Charlotte. Raymond said they couldn't really afford the trip right now. Mom makes $78,000 a year and her house has been paid off since 2019. April 2nd, called Mom at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. Raymond answered her cell phone, said she was resting. When I asked if I could just say hi, he said she needed quiet. I drove by the house an hour later. Her car was in the driveway. His was gone. April 19th, Mom and I went to lunch, just the two of us. She ordered a glass of wine and then put it back. Said Raymond preferred she watch her liver. She said it the way people say things they've been told enough times to repeat, but haven't yet decided to believe. June 8th, Mom looks thin. I asked if she was eating okay. She said she'd been having some stomach problems, Nothing serious, probably just stress. She'd lost maybe 15 pounds since Christmas. I know what you're thinking. It's what I told myself for months. You're projecting. You're looking for a reason to dislike him. You're turning normal into sinister because you're grieving your father, and you've transferred that onto your mother's happiness. I'm a medical coder. I work with diagnostic records all day. I know the difference between correlation and causation. But by August, my mother had lost 23 pounds and couldn't keep a full meal down. She was exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix. Her hands shook sometimes. Her doctor ran a panel and called it possible IBS, possible early perimenopause complications, possible stress, possible. Raymond took her to every appointment. He sat in the room with her every time. I only found this out because I asked Mom directly if I could come to one, and she said Raymond had already arranged to take her. When I showed up anyway, he was already in the waiting room, and when I suggested we both come in with her, something crossed his face. Just for a second, a tightening around the eyes, and then he smiled and said, of course, the more the merrier. In the car afterward, he made a comment about how nice it was that I had so much free time. I went home and added it to my notes. September brought two things: a urinary tract infection that landed Mom in urgent care, and the conversation I was not supposed to hear. I'd come over to drop off soup. Mom had texted that she was feeling rough, and let myself in with the spare key she'd given me years ago. Raymond didn't hear me come in. He was on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in that low, even tone people use when they think they're alone. I caught pieces. A name. I heard the Roanoke account twice. A number that sounded like a dollar amount with too many digits. And one sentence, clearly, she doesn't ask questions. That's not going to be a problem. He laughed at something the other person said. I stood in the hallway for 10 seconds, then walked back out the front door as quietly as I'd come in. I knocked loudly, gave it a few beats, and came in again calling my mom's name. Raymond was already in the living room when I walked through, coffee mug in hand, perfectly relaxed. Hey there, he said. Your mom's upstairs. She'll be glad you came. I brought soup, I said. You're a good daughter, he smiled. She's lucky to have you. I smiled back. That night I sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for a long time. I thought about what my next step should be, and I thought about how little I actually knew. And I thought about the fact that if I went to my mom right now, with a half-heard phone call and a list of observations, Raymond would call me paranoid, my mom might agree with him, and I would lose the ability to be close enough to see anything at all. So I didn't say anything. Not yet. What I did do, I called my dad's old friend, a retired attorney named Leonard Hawks, and I asked him to have coffee with me. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is rare. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "You need documentation, not impressions. If something financial is happening, there will be a paper trail. If something is happening to her health, there will be a medical trail. You need both." He gave me the name of a private investigator he trusted. I called her the next morning. Her name was Sondra. She was 50, practical, no nonsense, in the way of someone who has heard every variation of every story and stopped being shocked by any of them. 20 years ago, I gave her everything I had: Raymond's full name, his supposed history in Phoenix, the name I'd heard on the phone, what I could remember of the dollar amount. She said she'd start with his background and go from there. She said it would probably take 2 to 3 weeks. It took 8 days. Raymond Colt was not originally from Phoenix. He had lived there, but before that he'd lived in Memphis, and before that in Charlotte, my mother's sister city, a coincidence that made my stomach drop when Sondra told me, and before that in Cincinnati. In each city, there was a woman. In each city, there was a marriage or a long-term partnership. In each city, those relationships had ended with the woman financially depleted. One had sued him, the Memphis case, and the lawsuit had been settled out of court. In Phoenix, there was a woman named Barbara who had reported him to the police for harassment after their relationship ended. The report was filed, no charges stuck. He had never been convicted of anything. He had never had to be. I sat with this information for 3 days. I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about my mother upstairs in that house with a man whose real name I still didn't fully know, whose history was a series of quiet devastations, and who was currently the co-signatory on her bank accounts. Then Mom called me on a Thursday morning and said she was back in urgent care. Her heart had been doing something strange. They wanted to keep her for observation. I drove there in 11 minutes. I want to describe what happened in that hospital room carefully, because this is the part that changed everything, not just in the story, but in me. When I walked in, Raymond was already there, sitting in the chair next to Mom's bed, holding her hand. She looked small against the white sheets. She looked like she'd aged 5 years since Christmas. But she smiled when she saw me, genuinely. And something in my chest cracked open a little. I sat with them for an hour. We talked about nothing much. Raymond was attentive, solicitous. He got Mom a cup of ice chips when she asked the nurse twice about her discharge timeline, held her hand. A nurse came in to take Mom for an imaging scan. Raymond stood to go with her. I stood too. He looked at me. "You can wait here," he said. Easy. Casual, like it was a favor. "I'd like to come," I said. Something happened then. I don't know exactly what triggered it. Maybe he'd been carrying it all day. Maybe the hospital walls and the fluorescent lights in his own private calculus told him the risk was low. But the pleasantness dropped off his face like something unhooking. "I said you can wait here," he said, quietly. "This is between me and my wife." My mother was looking at her hands. "She's my mother," I said. What happened next happened fast. He stepped toward me, not far, not enough to call it a lunge, and said, very low, "You need to back off. You have always needed to back off." And then he grabbed my arm, hard, above the elbow, and shoved me backward. I went into the bedside table and caught myself, but the monitor cord caught my foot and I went down on one knee. The nurse who had been preparing the scan equipment turned around. My mother said his name. He was already stepping back, composing himself, starting to say something about how I tripped. But the nurse had seen. She pressed a call button. 2 more staff were there within 2 minutes. Raymond's voice turned reasonable and explanatory. There'd been a misunderstanding. His stepdaughter had lost her balance. He was just trying to help. And I watched him perform that transformation in real time and understood, with a cold clarity I hadn't felt before, exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. I pressed charges that evening. And here's the part I want to be clear about, because the question of why he wasn't arrested on the spot is one I've seen people ask about situations like this, and I want to answer it honestly. He wasn't arrested immediately because there were 2 conflicting accounts, because hospital security does not work like television, and because Raymond told a coherent, confident story before I'd finished shaking. What happened was that a police report was filed, a detective was assigned. I gave a formal statement, the nurse gave a formal statement, and Raymond was released pending investigation because a shove in a hospital room without a prior record of documented violence did not meet the threshold for immediate arrest under Virginia law at that moment. I know how that sounds. I know it's infuriating. I was infuriated. But Leonard, when I called him from the parking garage, said, "Good, you filed the report. That report exists now. Every piece of this is going to compound." He was right. Because, while I was filing that report, Sondra was doing something I'd asked her to do 3 days earlier, when I'd received her initial findings and decided to stop waiting. I had asked her to look specifically at my mother's medical records, the ones I had legal access to as her emergency contact, and to cross-reference the timeline of her illness against any household products, supplements, or prescriptions that Raymond had introduced. It took her a week to build the picture, and she did it with a toxicologist she worked with regularly. The answer, when it came, was arsenic. Not a dramatic dose, not a kill-her-this-week dose, a careful, chronic, low-level accumulation, the kind that mimics digestive issues, fatigue, cardiac irregularities, the kind that looks, under normal testing panels, like stress, like IBS, like age, the kind that takes a year or more to do what Raymond needed it to do. Sondra took what she had to the detective who'd been assigned to my assault report. She had enough. The toxicologist's analysis, the purchase record she traced through a cleaning supply Raymond bought in bulk, the timeline to bump this from a misdemeanor to something very different. The detective called me at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. He asked me to come in that day. I brought Leonard with me. The conversation that followed was 2 hours long. I gave them everything: Sondra's findings, my notes file, the partial phone conversation I'd overheard, the financial documentation Sondra had built around the Roanoke account, and two others under Raymond's name. Leonard had also, in the weeks prior, quietly contacted the attorney who had handled the Memphis civil lawsuit. That woman, Barbara had put her in touch, was willing to cooperate with the Virginia investigation. My mother was tested at the hospital the following morning. She did not know why at first. I was with her when the doctor explained what they'd found. She sat very still. She asked the doctor to repeat it. Then she looked at me. I don't have the words for what was on her face. I don't think I'll ever quite have the words for it. It wasn't shock exactly. It was more like watching someone recognize something they've been trying not to see for a long time. "How long have you known?" she asked me. "I suspected for months," I said. "I didn't have proof until recently." She nodded slowly. She didn't cry. Not right then. She reached over and took my hand. "Raymond was arrested on a Wednesday. Not at a dramatic cinematic moment. At the grocery store 2 miles from my mother's house, buying the kind of cleaning products Sondra had flagged. Two detectives, a warrant, and no fuss. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He did reportedly ask immediately for an attorney. He got one. It didn't help much. The investigation that followed was thorough in a way that I had not anticipated even after everything I'd learned. The Roanoke account held money drawn from my mother's savings over 18 months, a total of $94,000, moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic bank flags. There were two additional accounts under variations of his name. The Phoenix situation, which had never resulted in charges, was reopened by a detective there who had never been fully satisfied with how it had closed. The Memphis civil case became a criminal referral. They charged him in Virginia with felony financial exploitation of an elderly person, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, first-degree assault, and attempted murder by poisoning. The financial exploitation charge alone carried up to 20 years. Leonard told me the prosecution was building toward a sentence that would keep him incarcerated well past any realistic release age. He pled not guilty. The trial lasted 9 days. I testified for 4 hours across 2 days. I was asked more than once about the gap between when I first suspected something was wrong and when I took action. I answered honestly. I was afraid of being wrong. I was afraid that acting too soon would close off my ability to protect her. I had made the calculation that building an unbreakable case mattered more than acting on incomplete information. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Raymond was sentenced to 27 years. He will be 85 years old before he's eligible for parole. His attorney called it excessive. Leonard called it appropriate. I sat in that courtroom and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not even relief. Just a very quiet exhale, like something that had been pressing on my ribs for 2 years finally let go. My mother is recovering. The arsenic exposure has been treated, and her doctors are cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. She had to have some ongoing cardiac monitoring, and the fatigue lingered for longer than I would have liked. But she's back to calling me every Sunday. Her voice sounds different now. Not the grief quiet of before. Not the flat careful of the Raymond years. Something more open. A little more tired, maybe. In the way people get when they've been through something real and come out on the other side knowing themselves better. She doesn't talk about him much. When she does, it's brief, clinical, like she's describing a weather event, something that happened, that caused damage, that is now in the past. What she does talk about is Aunt Celia. She's planning a trip to Charlotte in the spring. She's already picked the hotel. The thing I want to say, the thing I kept coming back to throughout all of it, is that none of this happened because I was brave. I'm not sure bravery is the right word for any of it. What it actually was slower and more mundane than bravery. It was paying attention when everything in me wanted to stop. It was keeping a note file on my phone when I didn't know what I was building. It was asking Leonard for coffee instead of pretending I didn't need help. It was trusting Sondra to find what I couldn't find alone. It was understanding that the most dangerous thing I could do was act before I was ready. My mother lost money she will never get back. She lost time. She lost some part of her trust in her own judgment, and I watch her working to rebuild that in ways that are quiet and private and entirely hers. But she's here. She's calling me on Sundays. She's going to Charlotte in the spring. That, I've decided, is enough to build on. There's a version of this story where I storm into that house the moment I hear Raymond on the phone and confront him with nothing but suspicion and a bad feeling. I've thought about that version. In it, he denies everything. My mother defends him, and I get locked out. Not literally, but in the way that matters. He wins by making me look unhinged before I found a single piece of proof. That's the version I was most afraid of, and avoiding it required something harder than anger. It required me to sit with what I knew and do nothing with it until doing something would actually count. I'm not telling this to make myself sound calculated. In those months of watching and waiting, I was scared all the time. I second-guessed myself constantly. There were nights I lay awake thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if I put my mother through all of this and Raymond turns out to be exactly who he says he is? Just the man she loves, and I'm the one who broke her trust. That doubt was useful, actually. It kept me honest. It kept me from acting on emotion when what the situation demanded with clarity. Raymond made choices throughout this story that followed him the way choices do. Not through some cosmic ledger, but through the simple mechanical reality that actions leave traces. Financial transactions leave records. Health symptoms leave timelines. Patterns repeat because people don't change the parts of themselves they don't believe are wrong. Raymond had done this before. In Memphis, in Phoenix, in Charlotte. He'd always gotten away with it by finding women who trusted him before they understood him. He counted on that trust the same way every time. What he didn't account for was that love, real love, pays attention. I paid attention to my mother because I loved her. Not perfectly, not without doubt or fear, but consistently. That consistency is what built the case. Not any single brilliant move, but months of small, careful, unglamorous noticing. My mother had to reckon with something hard after this, the question of her own judgment. She trusted Raymond. She trusted him in ways that cost her significantly. I've watched her work through the shame of that, quietly, in the way she does things. What I want her to know, what I'd say to anyone in her position, is that trusting people is not a character flaw. Being deceived by someone skilled at deception is not a failure of intelligence. Raymond was practiced. He'd refined his method across multiple lives and multiple cities. My mother wasn't naive. She was human, and he was deliberately, expertly exploiting that. What Raymond had, in the end, was audacity and patience. What I had was something steadier, the willingness to do the right thing even when it was slow and unglamorous and uncertain. The willingness to ask for help, from Leonard, from Sondra, instead of pretending I could handle it alone, and the discipline to not let my fear push me into motion before I was ready. I think about that sometimes, how integrity isn't dramatic, how real moral courage usually looks like just continuing to show up, to the notes file, to the attorney's office, to the hospital room, when everything in you wants to either explode or give up. My mother's going to Charlotte in the spring. She called me last Sunday and told me she'd already found a restaurant near Aunt Celia's neighborhood that she wants to try. She sounded like herself. She sounded, if I'm honest, better than herself. Like someone who's been through the worst thing and discovered, on the other side, that she's still standing. That's not nothing. That's actually everything.